All right, well, IT is working with New York to get them pulled up and get started. I'll go ahead and kick things off with a quick intro. Hopefully they can get everything pulled up. So hello, everyone, both in the room and on the call. I know we also have folks from EMEA on this call as well, so love that it's global. Welcome to our live webinar, Fostering Transgender Inclusion, presented by Ben Demers. Ben, you gotta let me know if I pronounced that correctly. He's the Out&Equal University Senior Associate. My name is Allison Dingler. Most people call me Allie. My pronouns, which you'll learn more about in this session, are she and her. I'm a D&I program manager based out of the Austin Champions office. First off, I want to wish everyone a happy Pride Month. If you're curious what celebrations we have globally, we have some comms which will be released tomorrow, so keep an eye out for that. If you haven't seen them already, we also recently partnered with HR, Legal, and iPride to create the Gender Identity and Transition Guidelines. So if you haven't seen them, I invite everyone to take a look at those over on our Iqual page. We're excited to have partnered with Out&Equal both to host this webinar and as a sponsor of their upcoming Workplace Summit. This will be our second year in a row sponsoring. This year it'll be October 14th through 17th in Washington, D.C. As a quick reminder, this is a two-part webinar with the first hour covering terminology, allyship, transgender inclusion, and a Q&A. The second part, the last half hour, will be for a deep dive with our HR team. This webinar will be recorded and available with subtitles on the inclusion page within the next few days. And with that, I will go ahead and kick it off to Ben.
Awesome, thank you, Allison. The name pronunciation was perfect. So my name is Ben Demers. I use he, him pronouns. And as Allison said, I'm here today from an organization called Out&Equal Workplace Advocates. I'll talk to you a bit about, thinking through what trans inclusion in the workplace needs to look like. I want to mention before we really get started in this topic that there's not really any expectation of having any background knowledge in this. I think as LGBTQ topics, progress and advance, there's a lot of questions that people might be having that they don't even really know where to start researching. And I acknowledge that somebody who identifies as part of the community, who has also, studied these issues at an academic level and who now kind of works in this space. I have a lot more comfort probably speaking about these topics and these issues than a lot of individuals. So there's really no expectation of any, background knowledge, any background expertise. Really, we're just looking for you to come into today's session, open to speaking about these different topics and, asking the questions you might have. So I'm gonna kind of zip through some of our opening today. I'll give you a little bit more context about what we'll be talking about and a little more background on my organization. And then from there, we're going to go into talking a little bit about just kind of generally D&I work and sort of the approach to empathy that we want to be taking. And then we'll get more in depth into talking about identity and expression and what this can look like in the workplace. And then I want to talk about, why we're having this conversation here today. We're also just a quick audio thing. I think just going to mute y'all, Allie, so if you have anything you want to message, just send them to me and I can unmute.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ben.
Sure. Awesome. So then we're going to talk a bit about, why LGBTQ or why trans inclusion specifically in this case matters. So really why we're having this conversation still in the workplace and why I think it's really still necessary to be proactively having these conversations today, even as we see, inclusion becoming more the norm in certain locations. From there, I think we're going to do kind of a series of agree disagrees, which is going to kind of help us look more specifically about trans issues in the workplace and how we can be responding to them, both through policy, but also really just what our individual responses can be. And from there, we're going to talk about allyship, so really how we can kind of hone those responses so that we're kind of understanding colleagues and employees in the workplace. Awesome. So our learning objectives for today's session, as I was saying, we'll review key concepts in gender identity and expression. And so that'll really kind of build an understanding of these concepts because I think it's really important to have kind of the basis of this language, this shared language to be able to go off of and have these conversations. From there, talk about why trans inclusion matters, and then get into allyship best practices for the trans community. So that'll be really our first hour. And then as Allison was saying, we'll have that last half-hour session at the end where we'll talk specifically about HR issues and how in our HR job functions we can be more aware and more inclusive of trans employees. Awesome. So let's get started. Um, I want to give a little more context about the organization that I work with, Out&Equal. So Out&Equal was actually founded in 1996 by a woman who actually was finishing the seminary school when they found out that she was a lesbian and didn't allow her to finish. So she was somebody who knew, really firsthand what it can mean to be openly LGBTQ in this country, and to be denied the job that you want because of it. And so she really sought to sort of end that sort of discrimination and that sort of bias within workplaces across the country. So what we initially started rolling out education in this area. So, giving education around kind of the basics of LGBTQ issues. And from there, we really kind of saw our role advance from being an educator to a convener. So going from, sessions like this that we're hosting today to also organizing larger conferences, as Allison was mentioning. We host our workplace summit every October in a different US city. And so this conference really brings together, leaders in diversity and inclusion, in HR, in employee resource groups, as well as, out and ally executives who are dedicated to kind of advancing LGBTQ workplace inclusion in various ways. And so those are really the conversations that we're seeking to be having. So today we're super happy to be partnering both on this webinar, as well as Allison was mentioning our larger partnership with Indeed at the Workplace Summit. It's one that, I really love seeing the detail of it and the different things we've been able to do around career inclusion, around job inclusion. So really, looking forward to seeing this session as well as that partnership for us. I also want to review some of the basic things that we as an organization believe, because I think it sort of helps set the tone for the conversation. And we're getting a little bit of audio issues really quickly. I'm going to scoot my setup a little bit. Is this better? Hopefully, yeah. So if you keep having audio issues, just chat them in throughout. But I'm gonna keep going, and then, as I said, yeah, if you have anything, just stop me, and I can review something that I mentioned. Okay. Hang with us as we troubleshoot quickly. Can we actually have people message in if how the sound quality is sounding? Okay, awesome. So overall, it sounds pretty clear. So I think this is specific with a particular location. Awesome. Okay. Sounds like we got it sorted. Awesome. Okay. So really quickly, I want to review just kind of the basics of what we believe as an organization, because I think it really helps set the tone for today's conversation. And I'm sure a lot of them are tenets that I think most of you are probably familiar, having heard before within the D&I space. So the first is that no one should have to choose between being who they are and doing what they love. And I think really the more straightforward way of saying this is that no one should have to choose between being open about their sexual orientation or gender identity and getting a paycheck. And unfortunately, that's still a decision that many people have to make in this country today. The second is that our companies and organizations are strongest when we have welcoming and inclusive workplaces. So this is, of course, a pretty straightforward and basic argument in D&I that having more team backgrounds makes stronger conversations, and embracing those principles allows for more comfort within the workplace, which ultimately leads to more innovation and stronger products. The third is that each of us are responsible for creating out-and-equal workplaces. And so this is a very important one because, we all might have different job functions that allow us to differently affect people's everyday lives and employees' everyday lives. And I think it's awesome that we have a lot of HR-specific teams on today's call because they, of course, have a lot of effect on policy and benefits and things like that within an organization. But really, it's everybody's responsibility to be making your workplace inclusive and to be encouraging a culture where people feel like they can be openly themselves. And then lastly, our last one is diversity is about counting heads. Inclusion is about making heads count. Again, a phrase you've probably heard in D&I before, but this is really about saying, diversity is kind of where these conversations started. It's about having good representation within your company of people with different experiences and different backgrounds. Whereas inclusion is really about taking those differences and making those differences count. And so how do you make it so that employees feel like their different experiences and the knowledge that they've gained from those experiences, they can actually bring it into their work in a positive way and feel like they're giving their full self. So that's really the conversation that we're looking to be having. So I want to start really quickly actually with this concept of covering at work. So covering is a concept that comes from the research originally of a sociologist by the name of Irving Goffman. And he uses this term to refer to the way that individuals with known stigmatized identities will make an effort, a great effort, to keep this stigma from looming large. And so really what he's talking about here, it's not necessarily about, lying about your identity, but it's really just about kind of downplaying that identity, trying to keep it from being part of the conversation. This research was recently taken up by an individual by the name of Kenji Yoshino, a researcher at NYU, and actually a law professor. And he did some research with Deloitte, looking specifically about the ways that individuals cover at work. So, how do people downplay parts of themselves in the workplace just to kind of get by? And so they found, unsurprisingly, that 61% of individuals cover some part of their identities in the workplace, which I think is not surprising to many of us. And so, as I said, it's not really necessarily about lying about you hard, but it can be about downplaying it. So take, for instance, if you're a parent at work, and you might not lie if somebody asks if you have children, but you also might be cautious about having photos up of your family or wanting to mention your children, or leave early or leave right at 5 to pick up your kids if you have your commitment, because you don't necessarily want individuals to think you're not as committed to a project or something like that. So it's not necessarily about lying, but it can be more about downplaying that part of your identity. And so unsurprisingly, different groups cover in different ways. So 83% of LGB, so lesbian, gay, and bisexual respondents, cover in some way in the workplace. The research found that 79% of Black and African American respondents cover in some way, which can take all sorts of different forms to downplay. But also, and I think that this is really one of the more surprising things that came out of the research, is that 45% of straight white male respondents report covering in some way in the workplace. And these numbers, as you can imagine, as we get into today's conversations, are much higher for trans individuals compared to other groups of employees, even probably compared to lesbian, gay, and bisexual employees. And it's important to be thinking about, the different ways that we might cover, whether it be around race or religion or political affiliation or economic status and background, and all these different things that we sort of bring into our workplace experience and all the ways that we might not feel comfortable bringing them in. I think it's just an important thing to mention that, think of all the difficulties that you might have had not being able to express yourself, and then kind of use that empathy and use that experience that you're thinking to understand how trans individuals might be also having difficulties expressing themselves in the workplace, or all the challenges that they might face in areas where they feel like they need to cover parts of their identity, or where they don't feel like they can be authentically themselves, which we're going to sort of get into more as we advance in today's discussion. Quick water. Okay, so for those of you who are kind of new to the conversation around trans inclusion, I think that the location where you've probably heard it most, or the context in which you've heard it most, is kind of under the LGBT or LGBTQ community umbrella. So I want to start really quickly there before we really focus in on trans inclusion. So LGBT, this acronym that you've probably heard before, and you probably know it stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. So this term encapsulates both sexual orientations and gender identities. They're often kind of grouped together within this community. So lesbian, gay, and bisexual, these refer to sexual orientations, whereas transgender refers to gender identity and expression. And that's really what we're going to be focusing in on today. So whereas sexual orientation, the way that we think about it, it's really about who you love or who you're attracted to. Think of who you orient yourself towards. Gender identity is really more about who you are. It's about an internal sense of self, and it might be about how you express that. But really, it's thinking more about your personal identity, not as much in relation to others. And so these are different concepts and that's an important distinction to make. They also have this, especially in the United States, a long shared history of both oppression, but also very importantly of resistance. And a lot of kind of the community has grown together in a lot of ways, and so that's really why they're kind of grouped together under this umbrella, LGBT or LGBT. But that community definitely has specific issues that need to be focused in on. And kind of face specific challenges in today's workplaces. So that's really what we want to be focusing on. While there are many similarities amongst the community, there are also certain ways that we can help and be allies to our trans colleagues. So I want to kind of hop into the gender identity expression piece specifically, just to give us some of this, background terminology and background understanding of the concepts to then look at specifically how they might play out in the workplace. So the first thing that I want to do is actually kind of separate the meanings of sex and gender for today's conversation. So these are words that we very commonly use interchangeably. In kind of colloquial everyday speak, they often get kind of used back and forth, but I really want to kind of draw out the different things that they actually mean because they are distinct different words. So sex, or what we commonly refer to as sex assigned at birth, kind of within conversations around trans identity. Sex refers to a legal and medical designation assigned at birth based on an assessment of the body. So, when you're born, somebody, usually a doctor, if you're born in a hospital, if a doctor delivered you, will say sort of, okay, you have a boy, we'll hand you to your parents and we'll kind of make that designation. And that designation will stay with you throughout your life. And so that gets put on, your birth certificate, but it also will stick with you in all medical records. It'll go on all your legal documentation. It's associated with your social security number. It's associated, with your driver's license. It's on your passport if you have one. And so it's going to show up in all of these different places, really just based on this one quick assessment, when you're younger. And so the words that we usually use to refer to sex are male, female, or if somebody has intersex characteristics, that's also where you might know. Gender, however, gender is really all of the cultural meaning that we put on top of that. So gender, as it says here, refers to the cultural meanings such as masculinity or femininity assigned to biological sexes, male and female, within a specific time and place. So it's all of the things that we really kind of, when somebody has a particular sex assigned at birth, there are all sorts of things throughout their life where people will expect them to show gender in a particular way. And so we all sort of kind of build gender throughout our lives in that ways, whether it be around, how we dress, around how we speak, really around a lot of internal mental processes that we might even not think about being associated with gender, but are very different based on our different experiences of gender. And it's very common for these things to become something that we naturally think are linked in a certain way. Thinking that if you're born a particular sex, then you will express gender in a particular way. But it's important to also realize that gender is something that has changed throughout time and space. So, if you think of 300 years ago in the United States, the founding fathers, their expression of masculinity was very different than what it is now. They powdered their faces and they wore powdered wigs and they wore, frilly clothing. Whereas if they were to do that now, it wouldn't be considered particularly masculine. Same thing, kind of between countries. So if you think of a lot of countries in Latin America, it's very common for, men when they see each other to show a greeting by kissing each other on the cheek. Or I lived in Quebec for a long time, and it was also very common, French greeting, to give that kiss on the cheek to kind of show hello, show some affection. Whereas if you did that in the United States, it wouldn't be seen as particularly masculine. And so I mention this because it's important to realize that what we think of as kind of things that are automatically associated together quite commonly have been different throughout different times and spaces. So they're not necessarily naturally linked. They're just kind of what becomes common in our society. So getting in specifically at, sex assigned at birth and gender identity in relation to the trans community, both of these concepts can exist on what we call a spectrum, which you've probably heard before, within the sort of gender space, which really is just to say that they aren't black and white. So for different individuals, sex and gender can exist in different ways than just how we imagine men and women. Though for many individuals, they do exist within those categories. I would say probably the majority of individuals, especially in the United States, still do identify within these categories of men and women. But they really are things that people can identify outside of these set categories that we're kind of most familiar with, even if they do commonly match up for many of us. So it's important to remember that we all have a gender identity and we all have a sex assigned. I think it's very common when talking about, trans individuals in the trans community that we only think of trans individuals as having these categories, having these designations. So only them having a sex assigned at birth or having a gender identity, but really it's something that all of us have. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind. So, we can all be sort of placed on this spectrum, So if I'll take myself for an example. So sex assigned at birth, when I was born, the doctor said, okay, you have a boy, handed me to my parents. As I've grown up, I've pretty comfortably, associated with the category of man, first as a boy and then, growing into identifying as a man. So those categories have always worked decently well for me. So I would sort of, plot myself on the right of that sex assigned at birth spectrum, and then pretty far to the right on that gender identity spectrum. So the word that we use to refer to this, to have this sort of terminology, the shared terminology, is cisgender. So cisgender meaning your gender is the same as what was expected based on your sex assigned at birth. So think of cisgender, the root of the word, cis meaning same, gender, of course, meaning gender. To be transgender, the basic definition of this term is when your gender identity does not match what was expected based on your sex assigned at birth. So give an example of this. If somebody, was born male, but, growing up, they realized that this is not the category that actually matched their identity. So maybe they identify as a woman or they identify as a non-binary, but their gender identity is not what was expected based on their sex assigned at birth. And so pulling again from sort of the root of the word, trans, the Latin root means to cross. So think of, if you're going to be drawing it out on this spectrum, if you were to sort of start on male at sex assigned at birth, and then a lot of people might have expected you to identify as a man, but that is not what is comfortably identified with you for your life. You knew that that was not your gender identity. So you identified instead kind of across at a different spot on the spectrum. And so that's really just where that word comes from. Thinking back to kind of what I was saying earlier about this mention of time and space, also, I think this is a good place to mention that a lot of individuals might argue that trans identity is a fad. It's something that's really become more popular in the last few years. But what I think is important to mention and important to read more about if it's something that you're interested in is that trans identity has existed, in different societies, in different forms, as well as it existed in different forms kind of in different countries around the world today. And so we might think of it as something that's more recent, but it's really just that we have very particular terminology for it now and maybe a particular understanding. But there have always been individuals who have sort of existed around our expected experiences of gender and our expected expressions of gender. So it's important to kind of realize that's not just, something that's been happening in the last 10, 15 years. It's really something that historically you can put into a much larger context. So I think that's an important thing to say back to those who might kind of dismiss it as a fad, is that, it's something that's been around, or it's something that we need to kind of understand more deeply within our society. So some of the terminology that we were just sort of getting at, the gender binary is, I think, really just that basic idea of the simple kind of gender dichotomy of male and female. And so as we were saying, there are genders beyond that, but that's what the gender binary will refer to. If you hear somebody ever refer to that, it refers to the simple idea of man and woman. Transgender man, so you're more comfortable starting to use not only the term transgender and cisgender, but also, how individuals might use this in everyday speak, referring to a trans man, a trans woman, a non-binary individual. So when you refer to a transgender individual's gender, you refer to the gender that they identify with. So a trans man is a man who was assigned female at birth, but as identified as a man and expresses as a man. A transgender woman is a woman who is assigned male at birth. So assigned male at birth by the doctor, but grew up realizing that's not my gender identity. I identify as a woman, and may or may not have taken steps to kind of express that outwardly. That's what we refer to as a trans woman. And then, as I said, cisgender men and women are individuals whose gender identity and expression match what was expected based on their gender, or based on their sex assigned at birth. And so cisgender men and women, this term kind of gets brought up a little less commonly. Trans is usually the terminology that we focus on. But actually, as my boss likes to say, if you don't know the word cisgender, you probably are it. You've probably never been asked to use that before. But I think it's just good to sort of define what we might think of as the normal, just so that we have kind of these different terms to place next to each other. And realize that there really isn't no central normal. There's just different ways that people identify. Cool. So there are lots of different terms that fall under what we kind of call the trans umbrella here at Out&Equal. And so I've been talking a bit about the gender binary, and you'll have a lot of individuals who might identify as, a trans woman, a trans man, so kind of still along that binary. But you also more and more are seeing people identify outside of that binary. So with categories of gender that are outside man and woman. So you might see somebody identifying as gender fluid. So this means maybe their identification with gender changes throughout time. That's the idea of fluidity and this desire to not pin it down at any one point. You might see somebody identify as gender queer, as gender nonconforming. And so all of these terms as agender, so not really identifying with any type of gender. As queer, which is used pretty similarly to gender queer, these two terms in relation to gender. I would probably say gender queer is like a little more common to see, but you might see also somebody just refer to their identity as queer, as non-binary. And so all of these terms mean slightly different things. And the idea is really not to overwhelm you with sort of all of these categories. The idea is really just to say, you know, if you are interested in learning more about all of the different definitions, we can maybe talk a bit about more about it in the Q&A period, but I really encourage you to read more about it if it's something you are interested in. The takeaway really though is just about saying their language is ever expanding, and within the LGBTQ community, I acknowledge that, you know, we have a lot of different terms that individuals use. The important thing is to be respecting and reflecting the language that individuals use back to them as much as possible, just because you never know sort of the journey that somebody has gone through to get to that place with language. And often it's been, you know, a very long journey that has maybe been a very difficult journey. And there's a lot of power really in kind of finding terms that you can use together as a community and that you can use to refer to yourself in a way that feels comfortable. And so I just want to encourage you to never downplay sort of the power of that realization and of that language, and to always be supporting people sort of in that journey. So just so you have a bit of a definition of non-binary, so you can use this to, I think, kind of apply to a lot of the different terms that we just talked about, sort of loosely. So non-binary refers to a gender identity which falls outside of the gender binary, as we said, so outside of that idea of man and woman. So that might mean an individual does not identify as strictly female or male. This person can identify as both or neither male or female, or sometimes one or the other, or as a space. So that's just really a basic definition. And, you know, if you're ever wondering about it, the recording of this session will be made available, so you can always kind of come back to these terms. And we also have resources around this topic on our website. But really, it's a very broad term for sure that encapsulates lots of different types of identities that fall into it. Now, we talked a little bit about the difference between sex and gender, and we spent some time kind of, you know, working through distinguishing that. But within gender and within the terms we use to refer to gender, I also want to take a moment to distinguish between gender identity and expression. And I think that you'll very commonly hear these two phrases said together, you know, quite quickly, as, you know, it almost becomes one word with the speed that some people say it. But I want to take a moment to sort of flesh it out because they're useful in understanding a definition that we'll talk about after. So gender identity, as we discussed it, this refers to how one self-identifies. So this is about, you know, how one sees oneself. It's a mental process really around gender. And so the words that we commonly use to refer to this, male, female, man, or woman are often commonly also used. As trans, as genderqueer. Gender expression, on the other hand, refers to how one does gender. So really how one performs gender and shows it to the world. So as we were saying, this can, you know, look anything like the way that you dress, the way that you speak, along with a lot of different ways that we might show gender in everyday interactions. Both these terms are kind of necessary, I think, for understanding another term that you hear very commonly in relation to the trans community, and especially when talking about trans experiences at work. And that word is transition. So transition, as we define it at Out&Equal, refers to the process that one might go through to take steps so that your gender expression, the way that you show gender, more closely reflects your gender identity. So when you think of a transition of somebody going through a transition at work, it's not about changing their internal gender identity. It's about taking steps to better show that gender identity to the world. And so changing their gender expression to better show their true self or authentic self outwardly. And so that's really what this idea of transition gets at. And it can look different for different individuals. So, you know, we've talked about all the ways that somebody might express gender through speech, through physical appearance, through things like this. So it might mean changing different things within these categories. So, you know, changing the way you dress, changing the way you speak. It might also mean changing your name and changing the pronouns that you use, kind of associated with your gender. So that can also have, you know, all sorts of different implications. And it can also potentially have sort of legal and medical, you know, components to it, in the sense that you kind of have to change your gender on a lot of different legal legal spaces. So, you have to change it on your license, change it on your passport if possible. So it can be a long process, and it's one that someone will often think a lot about before, coming to someone with this. And so especially, I think that's an important thing to keep in mind if anybody ever comes to you at work mentioning that they're hoping to go through a transition and looking for support from the company. It's something that they've thought a lot about. It's not usually just something that happens on a whim. So to kind of give them that legitimacy when having that conversation. I'm going to zip through this next part just a little bit. I do want to give you some of this background knowledge, but I also kind of want to leave time for some of our conversations later. So really quickly, a stat that I think is super important to be showing is the fact that discrimination for trans individuals in the United States today, 90% of trans individuals report facing some form of discrimination, whether that be, verbal harassment or intimidation, whether that be sexual harassment, whether that be physical harassment, whether that be, being passed up for a job, even though you were the right person for it, being passed up for a project or promotion. It can take all sorts of different forms, and it's important to think about all these different things that somebody might be facing in the workplace and how it might be, negatively affecting their workplace experience. Because of this fear of discrimination, trans individuals report putting all sorts of different efforts to sort of avoiding this discrimination and all the negative effects that it can have really on their job experience. So 77% of trans individuals report taking some sort of action to sort of avoid this discrimination. So this might mean, hiding their gender identity. So we talked a bit about covering earlier. So downplaying their gender identity and not wanting to express it openly, even if that takes a very serious personal toll, and even if they feel that they are at a point where they would like to authentically express themselves. This can also mean, delaying transition, which can also have super serious effects on somebody if they're kind of ready to take that step with their gender to outwardly express it and they aren't able to. And then also, many individuals report, being in a discriminatory environment that led them to ultimately give up what they had, which I don't think, as many of you as HR individuals, but just kind of as employees more generally, I don't think I need to mention why this can be such a negative thing, both for the trans individuals, but also kind of for the company to be losing this talent. It's also worthwhile to mention that this is something that, while it's existed, really kind of throughout the time, you are seeing people more openly identify with this category within the United States. It's kind of just really as we have our conversations around gender are evolving within the United States and kind of within the world more broadly. And so you're more and more seeing younger generations openly identify as either trans or sort of outside of the gender binary. So it's important to know that not only do you need to be having these conversations today, but they're going to become even more important 5, 10, 20 years down the road as you have more employees who are really identifying with these categories and who are thinking about gender in different ways that policies or your infrastructure might not necessarily reflect. So it's important to make sure that those employees are feeling included. The state of legislative inclusion also for trans individuals varies widely from place to place. And that's, I think, just kind of an important background context for understanding the experiences that trans individuals might be having. So if you're looking here at, a global map of legislation, different countries around the world have protections at the federal level to protect for gender identity and expression. But many countries, you can see in Latin America, Greenland, different parts of Western Europe, sort of Central Asia there. These are countries that do have protections based on gender identity at the national level. But countries in red and countries in blue are countries that do not. So this is including countries like Russia, China, large parts of Africa and the Middle East, as well as the United States. And so the fact that there's no sort of federal protection for this, it often can become sort of a patchwork throughout the country. And that's what happens in the United States, is that we have really a patchwork of laws that sort of certain states will protect against discrimination while others won't have any legislation around this. So you have a lot of states like these dark green states here. So, you think of California, Nevada, Massachusetts, Maine, Minnesota. These are states that do have protections based on both sexual orientation and gender identity within the United States, kind of around workplace discrimination. You have a few states like Pennsylvania and New York that actually interpret the word sex within their state, non-discrimination code to encapsulate gender identity and expression. But the majority of states, unfortunately, these states in tan, so like Montana, Texas, Florida, North Carolina, all of these states do not have a state level protection based on gender identity. And so because there really isn't this super fantastic legislative net in the United States, this is why people really look to companies. This is why it's fantastic to see that Indeed does have policies in this space to protect their trans employees, because it's really, you don't necessarily have legal recourse outside of the company within a lot of these states. And so that's why it's super important that companies are having consistent policies that protect their employees. That sort of sets the law, sets the tone within the company. So that gives you a bit of the background knowledge. I want to actually do some agree disagrees now as a group, so get a little more interactive for a few moments. I know we've been sort of squeezing some of this material, but you know, it's a lot to get through in an hour for sure. But I want to kind of hear some people's thoughts around how you can be starting to show your allyship, or how you can be starting to respond to trans issues within the workplace. So I want people to sort of chat in their responses to the different questions that'll be sort of popping up on the screen with whether you agree or disagree, and then, you know, some of the thoughts you might be having around why you agree or disagree. So let's start off with this. I should be able to use whatever pronouns for my coworkers I'm most comfortable using. So getting some chat-ins, some agree, some disagree, and getting some disagrees. Is anybody thinking about, you know, why they agree or why they disagree? Awesome, disagree. So primarily we're seeing disagrees, and somebody saying, you know, what they're most comfortable with, not what I'm most comfortable with. I see a few people went back and correct. They said disagree, we read it wrong. No worries. So a lot of people saying, yeah, they disagree because you should be using the pronouns that and the name that the individual is most comfortable with, not that you're most comfortable with. So awesome. That's definitely the response that we're looking to see. So you should be using the name and the pronouns that the individual is most comfortable with, not what you are most comfortable with. And so there's lots of different pronouns that you might see. So he, him, she, hers are probably the most common that we see singularly used in our society. So, you know, if somebody goes through a transition, you know, from identifying or from like outwardly expressing as a man to expressing as a woman, and that's the gender with which they identify, and they ask you to use she, her pronouns, that's sort of the jump that you would make, is to, rather than using he, him pronouns for that individual, you'd use she, her pronouns for that individual. And yes, it's a process that can sometimes, you know, take a bit of time, but it's definitely one that when you put in effort, it's a change that can be made. You know, think about maybe a time that somebody you know has gotten married, and they changed their last name, and maybe it took some time for you to start using a different name for that individual, but definitely with some mental energy, you were able to kind of make that shift, and eventually it just became second nature. It became, you know, what you knew for that individual. You're also starting to see, especially as more people identify as non-binary and sort of outside of the gender binary, you're seeing a lot more individuals use they, them pronouns singularly. And so this is exactly what it sounds like, where, you know, in singular pronoun cases, you would insert a they, them pronoun, which a lot of individuals I think are most commonly used to using these in plural senses. And you'll even sometimes get some pushback that it's not grammatically correct, which can be a very frustrating argument. But I think it's important to point out actually that there are many places within the English language that we do use they, them pronouns singularly. If you think about, if somebody, you know, if one of your coworkers or one of your friends said, oh my gosh, my child is hurt, and you didn't know the gender of their child, you would say, are they okay? So there are places in language where all the time we're using they singularly, and you're more and more probably going to be seeing people use these categories. And I see a question coming in here that I'm actually going to get to in just a moment. So you also see some pronouns here at the bottom. So sie, her, hers, and sie, zer, zers. So these are pronouns that are becoming, again, more popular as more people identify outside of the gender binary. I would say sie, zer, zers is the more popular of those two options there. These are probably ones that you aren't going to see super often, but I wouldn't be surprised if you start to see them a bit more in office settings. They, them, theirs are probably overwhelmingly the most popular ones that are being used by non-binary individuals. But again, even though z's or zers adds kind of the additional difficulty of not really being comfortable with this pronoun the way that you might be with they, them, it's a change that can be made, and it's always important to be thinking about the ways that language is, you know, updating and adapting itself so that we can make it more inclusive for people. So that's kind of always a process that we're going through. There's also a note on this slide that I want to point out. It's okay to ask somebody what their pronouns are. I think a lot of us are often afraid to do this, and it can feel super awkward to sort of initiate this conversation. But excuse me, it's fully okay to be doing this. You know, it might not be something that you want to do in a group setting to only an individual whose pronouns you aren't overly able to you know, guess in that moment. But I think kind of the best practice in this space, which is sort of what we were doing on this webinar today, is that if you don't know somebody's pronouns, open up the space for them to tell you them by saying, you know, hi, my name's Ben. I use he, him pronouns. Oh, sorry, I got another question. If Z and Z, so I actually have not seen, we're getting a question in the chat that says, can you clarify if Z spelled Z-E and then Z spelled Z-I-E are pronounced the same? And yes, they are. So now I see what you're saying on the slide here. They would be pronounced kind of interchangeably. So with the Z pronunciation. So yeah, going back to the asking, so it might not be the best to, you know, kind of pinpoint somebody in a group setting and say, you know, what are your pronouns? But the best practice around this is really about introducing your own pronouns and opening up a space if possible. So, you know, saying, hi, my name is Ben, I use he, him pronouns. And that I think really signals to individuals that it's a comfortable space for them to also express their pronouns. I think it's probably one of the biggest things. It shows that you're, you know, thinking about gender. It shows that you're kind of aware of the changes in gender, ways that people are identifying different. And that can be a really positive thing to signal to, especially a new employee, but really just any employee at your workplace who isn't sure how different people are responding to their gender, and have maybe faced negative experiences before. It's really important to show them kind of that positive reinforcement that you're there and that you understand and that you just want to know more about them. I also want to bring up actually some really fantastic language from Indeed's transition guidelines, just so you see sort of the policy side of this at Indeed. So you can see here the language from the guidelines. In everyday written and oral speech, a new name and pronoun should be used when an Indeedian is ready and has transitioned. So it's kind of the part of this, the paragraph before this that I cut out. So this is when somebody is going through a transition, the new name and pronoun should be used. If the coworkers are not certain which pronouns to use, then they should respectfully ask the transitioning Indeedian or the manager to confirm their name and pronouns. And so we mentioned this also sort of coming from a policy side, because people can often be kind of confused about when, you know, using the incorrect name or the incorrect gender pronoun becomes discrimination or becomes sort of harassment. And that's, I think, sort of an important distinction to be talking about proactively. So, you know, sorry, really quickly got a message there. So, sorry, having a very quick tech issue. Okay, so yeah, so as I was saying, it's important to be having, you know, proactive conversations around when misgendering, around using the wrong name becomes sort of a form of discrimination. I think a lot of what we're looking for here is the intent. As I mentioned, it can be sort of a difficult transition to make to using new language, but it's one that with mental effort really can be made. But you sort of do have to put in that effort. It's when somebody is repeatedly, you know, saying it in a very particular tone and taking a very particular approach. It's often pretty obvious when somebody is refusing to make that shift. And often, if you have a conversation with them around the topic, they'll show sort of their disdain or their a disgruntled nature around speaking about it. So it's one that's going to be, you know, case by case, unfortunately, because it is sometimes difficult to tell. But the individuals who are not looking to harass are going to put in that effort and are going to, you know, improve their language over time, where certain individuals will not. And it sort of becomes, you know, a case by case or framework for finding out when that is. Let's try another one. So trans individuals are gay, lesbian, or bisexual. So if you agree or disagree, you can chat that in. So we're getting lots of disagrees. Disagree. Okay. So I will say this is technically sort of a trick question, because the answer is they can be. And so I think a lot of what we're getting with the disagrees here is that they aren't necessarily. So good, again, going back to that concept that, you know, gender identity and expression are distinct concepts. They don't cover the same things. But of course, you know, trans individuals can be gay, lesbian, or bisexual. They are just distinct concepts. So you might, you know, have a lesbian trans woman. So a trans woman who is attracted to other women. You might have a gay trans man, so a trans man who is attracted to other men. But you also will have many, straight identifying trans individuals. Or you'll have a lot of people who will identify their gender and their sexuality really outside of these fixed categories. So, who might identify as queer in relation to both their sexuality and their gender. So meaning they're not as tightly in a category. It really is more about the individual it's on sort of more of a person by person basis and figuring out your attraction to those individuals. So good that we're realizing that these are distinct concepts. So you can have a gay or lesbian trans individual, but you can also have lots of different sexualities. Let's do another. So if a coworker is uncomfortable sharing a restroom with a trans colleague, my company should ask the trans employee to use a different bathroom. Disagree? No. And just be thinking about reasons why as you're chatting in. But getting lots of good disagrees, so that's awesome. Disagree, disagree. Yeah. So that's really the response that we're looking for here. If a coworker is uncomfortable sharing a restroom with a trans colleague, it's not the trans individual who should have to use a different bathroom. And I think it's important to understand the ways that allowing an individual to use the facilities, whether that be a locker room or a bathroom or a different facility within your company, allowing these individuals to use these facilities that match their gender identity, that just allowing for that is a simple thing that affirms their identity. And it's important to think of all of the extremely negative consequences that can happen if you don't allow for that. So forcing somebody to use the bathroom that goes with their sex assigned at birth, that shows them that you don't really validate their identity, and that can have super negative consequences for them feeling comfortable and then feeling like they belong within that workplace. I think it's also important to think of some of the arguments that people sometimes use in relation to bathrooms. And so you might have an individual saying that they don't feel super comfortable with a trans individual in the bathroom with them. And some people sometimes point to the potential of violence. And while I'm not really here to discredit people's concerns of violence or not, that's definitely not my goal on this webinar. I think it's important to look at the facts of this situation, and that the vast majority of cases of violence within restrooms involving trans individuals, the violence is against the trans individual. So I think it's important to see the way that this discourse is actually being used, really kind of understanding, kind of the stakes of these conversations and why we want to be talking about this proactively. And again, looking at transition guidelines from Indeed, transgender Indeedians are permitted to use the restroom and locker room facilities that correspond to their gender identity. So you even have a policy to point to kind of if the conversation comes up. I want to speed ahead a little bit. I'm going to do one last agree disagree here, and then I want to be able to have 2-3 minutes of discussion about allyship. And I apologize that we're squeezing in the end a bit. So when a coworker transitions at work, a great way to connect with them is to ask about what surgeries they've had. So if you agree or disagree, feel free to chat that in. Oh my God, no, it's none of your business. Love that. Getting lots of disagrees again. Awesome. So yeah, so again, this is definitely a spot where we're looking for individuals to disagree. I think it's common for individuals when they don't really have a lot of experience with trans issues to be curious about what transition might mean. And I think it's a very common perception of transition that we think that it necessarily involves surgery. But these disagrees, I want to reinforce them for sort of 2 reasons. The first being, of course, you don't ask this because you would provide the same privacy and the same respect to your trans colleagues that you would give to anybody else. So you wouldn't ask anybody else about the surgeries that they're having. But also, I want to sort of divorce the idea that transition necessarily means surgical change. For some individuals, it will, but for many individuals, transition doesn't involve surgery at all. It involves other processes. So it's important to not necessarily think that these things happen. Now, I want to skip ahead just a bit to talk about allyship, sort of within relation to the trans community. So ally is probably a term that you've used, heard before, especially in relation to, diversity work more generally, but also maybe specifically in relation to the LGBTQ community and the trans community. And so ally, the way we use it at Out&Equal, it refers to a person who actively supports, respects, and advocates for members of the LGBT community and actively works to confront homo, bi, and transphobia within society. And so if you can't tell, the key word here is actively. So allyship is really something, you don't just get a pin in 2002 and you're an ally forever. It's really something that you're actively practicing and actively learning how to better practice it. So there's sort of some basic guidelines that we've sort of distilled for how you can show allyship at work. The biggest thing I think can be educating yourself on trans issues. And, Gold Star already being on this webinar today, you've already shown that you're curious about this topic and trying to learn more about it. So that's definitely sort of a central one to this. The next is addressing misunderstandings as they arise. So as I've kind of said throughout this presentation, as somebody is transitioning, you might make mistakes. And, if it's something that you haven't necessarily been a part of before, it's very common to be making mistakes throughout. But sort of addressing those mistakes as they come up and sort of saying, not making a big hullabaloo about it, just apologizing and saying, I'll do better next time. That's, I think, a really important process of allyship. The next is listening carefully to your trans colleagues. And so, of course, the people who best understand, trans experiences in your office are going to be your trans colleagues. So in whatever ways you can listen to the things that they need and sort of, amplify those, that's a very important process. So amplifying trans voices and sort of just amplifying the voices of, different communities within your office more generally. This is especially important both in sort of the immediate setting, if you're in a meeting and somebody's ideas get sort of, like mulled over, but then somebody else gets praised for the same idea, which is a topic we very commonly have spoken about in relation to, kind of women's roles in the office and the different discrimination that women face in offices. It can be similar that you sort of need to, point to trans individuals and their ideas and sort of make sure that they get the credit that they're due. It can also mean that if somebody's facing discrimination, that you sort of seek to amplify the issue. You don't not amplify the issue, but to amplify their voice and amplify their complaint and make sure that it's taken seriously. And this is something that's especially important to keep in mind if you're a manager or if you even have an executive position, ways that you can sort of make the complaints and the issues faced by employees heard at a higher level. And then speaking up when you hear something inappropriate. So whether that be, something inappropriate is happening to an employee, or if it means, you just hear a joke, which I think is a super common way that you can show your allyship. If somebody references trans individuals negatively or makes jokes about them, not making the trans individual be the one who speaks up, you being the one to speak up and say that was inappropriate and that's not going to fly here. And then last, I think really simply just kind of respecting different individuals' identities. Like I said, the point of today's webinar was not to make sure that you leave knowing 100 different terms. The point is that you understand that it's often a journey to get to where people are with their identity. One that has taken a very long time, has maybe faced a lot of hardships, and they have a lot of power in finding that language for themselves. So respecting that identity and showing that respect in all sorts of different ways within our office is super important. So we talked a bit about these specific things as we went through the different agreed to disagree. So, letting trans individuals come out when and if they would like to, allowing people to use the facilities that correspond with their gender identity, using the correct pronouns and names, as well as giving the same respect and privacy to your trans colleagues that you give to other colleagues. We talked a bit about making mistakes, and I'm sort of just zipping through these last parts because we're coming up about on our hour here, and so I want to leave time for Q&A before we sort of move into our HR specific session if there are any. So if anybody has any questions on the line now, feel welcome to chat them in. Also, if you're thinking about them after, I'm going to chat out my email address. So if also you have any questions as we've been having this conversation today, but you don't want to ask it quite yet, also feel welcome to shoot me an email. This is really what my job is. I love answering these questions around the ways that we can be more inclusive to our LGBTQ colleagues and employees. And so if you're having any questions, feel welcome to reach out to me directly. Got another question here that says, is there a way to verbally differentiate between her and her, so HIR and HER? I believe that they're used interchangeably. I've always colloquially used them interchangeably, but this actually, I want to bring up that regional pronunciations of some of these different terms can actually change. So you might see somebody using, Z here, hears, spelled HIR, but I also have heard a lot of individuals use HIR, the same pronunciation as her, and really just seeking to sort of distinguish it in written communications. Awesome. Well, that's sort of the first hour of the session of the things we wanted to cover. So I appreciate everybody who's only able to stay for this first part of the session for sticking around for this. I'm going to hand it over actually to Allison, if you'd sort of do the transition to our next part of this presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. First off, thank you so much, Ben, for going through all of that information. I know we've been getting some chats and some good feedback in the session, so thank you everybody for participating. We're going to give a couple of minutes. Let's take 2 minutes if that works for you, Ben. And if folks are in HR, please feel free to hang on to the call. This is going to be a bit of a deeper dive for folks in HR to go through things like benefits and that kind of stuff. So if you're interested and in HR, please feel free to hang on the call. If not, just let me know if you have any questions, or Ben also provided his email in the chat. And thank you for joining us. So we'll give it 2 minutes, Ben, if that works for you, and let some folks take a quick break. Oh, I'm going to say that's a yes. Thank you. All right, I think we are ready to go when you are, Ben.
Sorry about that. I started and was on mute. So thank you everybody who stuck around, who's sticking around for this next half-hour session. So obviously for that first hour, we sort of focused primarily on introductory terminology, and we got a lot of content in there around that. as well as looking at specific workplace issues that commonly come up for trans individuals. So talking about, refusing to use somebody's preferred name and pronouns, refusing to use or refusing to allow somebody to use the correct restroom facilities or locker room facilities, or just asking people inappropriate questions. These are very common issues that come up. For the next half hour, I'm going to review some sort of basic questions that I want to encourage you to ask yourselves within your HR function and within your role. Be sort of fostering inclusion for your trans employees within those roles. So, thinking of the different guidelines that you can set up and ways you make these questions a natural part of the process. So I've split these questions into 4 categories. We're going to talk a bit about anti-discrimination policies. We're going to talk a bit about healthcare benefits, then about data collection, and then finally about diversity programming. I expect that your job function doesn't necessarily touch on all of these, but maybe for some of you it does. And in general, they're just good things to be aware about. And I know I only have you for half hour, a little under half hour, I guess about 21 minutes. So let's just sort of dive right in, and I'll go through the questions. And really this session, more so than the first hour, as I'm reading through the different questions, I'll talk a bit about why the questions are so important, but if you have anything you'd like to add or that you'd like to ask, you're welcome to be typing in as we go along. And so this session can really be as conversational as you would like it to be. And I'm also going to leave a bit of time for Q&A at the end of the session, hopefully a little more than we were able to leave with the last session. So really quickly to set the context, I want to go back to that map that I showed earlier. As I mentioned, because legislation changes around the world, most companies look to keep their policies pretty globally consistent. So when you look at, HRC releasing different scores around LGBTQ inclusion, so one of the major pillars of this score is policies and benefits and their consistency. And so I think it's something like 93% of companies that have inclusive policies have these companies at the global level. So, not only do you have this in the United States where maybe the conversation was started within your company, you make sure that these benefits are offered to all of your employees around the world. Obviously, this is a conversation that as you're talking globally, you also have to be talking about implementation globally. So, what implementation of different policies looks like in different countries. So it's always good to be proactively having that conversation, especially if it's within a country that you're worried the legislative situation is different than, the country where you're headquartered. It's different than the legislative situation within the United States. So it's always good to be discussing what it looks like in each of your different locations and sort of the barriers that you might face, both, from potentially from employees, but also from, specifically the people who are meant to be carrying out these policies. You can sometimes face some pushback. So it's always important to be having conversations around what implementation looks like and how you can really just send clear messaging globally. Within the US, as we mentioned, virtually every company keeps their policies consistent across states. So even while I said something like 93% of companies keep it consistent globally, there are a few that do not. Within the United States, I have never encountered really a company that does it differently in different states. Implementation, again, might be different, but it's not super different. It's usually within the United States, you set a policy and that's the policy you're going to really follow in every different location. So whether, you have your offices in Texas or whether you have it in California, you're going to follow really kind of the same anti-discrimination policies from location to location. What I think is important is that, to have some sort of awareness around both general societal attitudes within different locations, especially if you have remote employees who you might be working with in different locations, understanding the different challenges that they might be facing in their immediate location, but to also really understand sort of, how the legislative situation can affect the culture in different locations, and sort of what different conversations at both a national or a state level, the effect that can be having on employees. Think about conversations that we're having right now around things like the Equality Act, which is a federal level legislation that just passed through the House and is probably not going to be brought to the Senate, but there's a whole conversation around that. And this seeks to, really instill within US law that discrimination against LGBTQ individuals, so both based on sexual orientation, but also gender identity and expression, to make sure that this is outlawed. So keep in mind that, responses to things like this and the different legislation that is being discussed at the national level, when a decision is made, it can obviously have a big difference based on, or it can have a big impact on employees who it's directly impacting and who are kind of, mentioned within the law. So it's just always important to be remembering those distinctions. We're getting a question in here: what is explicitly interprets existing prohibition on? So I believe I know where that is. So explicitly interprets existing prohibition on, but what that's referring to is these states, I believe it's 3 states, New York, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. These states have prohibitions on sex discrimination. So they have a state level law that outlaws discrimination based on sex. They have that within their state constitution. They interpret that language to also prohibit discrimination. So that's where the word prohibition is coming in, prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. So they interpret it in that way. That's something that has in the past also been done at the national level. So the Obama administration also did that. That is not done under the Trump administration. So it's something that can really, vary from administration to administration, and just really what the general political storm is in the United States at that time. So let's hop a bit into the questions that I want to review. And let's start off talking about anti-discrimination policies. So first part of this question. So do you have anti-discrimination policies based on gender identity and expression at all levels of operation? So this is one that the answer for Indeed is yes. This is often an issue for companies more so when I'm talking about different levels. This is usually an issue more so for companies that have, manufacturing sites where policies might be different from headquarters, but Indeed structure that doesn't really come up in the same way. But it's also just, important to make sure that for remote employees, they have a full understanding of their policies and the protections that they have as well. But this, for the most part, having these policies in place is something that Indeed has, put the effort to do, which is awesome. So the second part of this question, are you proactively having conversations about what implementing these policies will look like around things like misgendering, restroom use, etc.? So obviously, just by taking part in this webinar today, you are proactively having these conversations. But the other thing that I want to point to is that keep in mind ways that you can be, having conversations within, especially when you're talking about punishment or possible repercussions for discrimination. It's always good to be speaking as a team about what misgendering actually looks like, and what things like, discrimination in regards to restroom looks like. It's important to be having these conversations proactively to say, where is that line for us? And of course, we talked a bit about how it is kind of a case-by-case basis. And so, you need to really look at the tone that somebody was using and how often they've repeated it, and if they put any effort in and what their general outlook and relationship with this individual is. All of those things are obviously going to come as factors, but it's usually best if you've had this conversation ahead of, the first complaint. So if the first time you're talking about it is when, a trans individual comes to you saying somebody is misgendering me, it's probably not, it's something that's going to be sort of a quick response to it. And I think as much as possible, try to be having these conversations proactively. So the second point that I want to bring up about non-discrimination policies is asking, do you offer employee education to help employees carry out non-discrimination policies effectively at which levels of the organization? So again, of course, webinars like today, the idea is so that your employees or individual employees understand the basics of trans identity so that they can adequately show respect, so that they understand what it means to show basic respect to their trans colleagues. That's really the point of the conversation that we had in the first hour today. But more generally, if you're going to have non-discrimination policies in place, so it's always going to be thinking about what education you're offering or what ways you can clarify that policy for somebody who might know very little about trans identity. And this is true both for those individuals who, might have the best intentions and really just don't know much, as well as for those who, might not have the best intentions and who are looking to be a little more troublesome and who maybe aren't as open to these conversations. So just being aware of, how you can educate them around what the policies are and making sure that they're enforced. And then the third section that I want to bring up, this is probably one that's most important for those of you who work in recruitment in any way. But it's, are you proactively having conversations around how trans discrimination may factor into recruitment, as well as how to allay concerns that trans individuals may have in the process? So I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. So the first part of this conversation, or this point, are you proactively having conversations around how trans discrimination may factor into recruitment? That's really just a general conversation around, unconscious bias or around conscious bias. Making sure that that's not something that factors into the process, but that's a conversation that you're already having. That's kind of the norm. The thing that I also encourage you to be considering, and which is still sort of creative solutions are still coming up to this, think about the ways that trans individuals might be having particular concerns within an interview process or within really just the application process more general. This is something that has really come out of discussions I've had a lot with career centers at universities that trans students face as they're really looking for jobs. But a lot of people have a lot of concerns around, if I have transitioned recently, What name do I use in my resume? What name do I use for my references? If my references knew me by a different name, and I don't necessarily want somebody to reach out to them using the name that I used before, or if I don't want somebody to reach out to them letting them know transition because I know that they wouldn't be comfortable with that and I don't want to sort of sour that relationship, sour that preference. A lot of people can have concerns around this. I don't know if background checks comes up much in your sort of hiring process for particular jobs at Indeed, but this is also a place where trans individuals have a lot of concerns around, what's going to happen if somebody does a background check at work and all of these things come up that I didn't necessarily want them to know. So I think it's sort of, there's definitely a part of this where the trans individual who's applying for a job will likely be proactive about a lot of these things because they have these concerns. But also, I think it's just always good to be thinking about ways that you can, make it as explicit as possible that these concerns are seen. And I'm sure that you have, discussing as like an equal opportunity employer that somebody will not be discriminated against based on their gender identity or expression. But it's always just good to be thinking of ways that this actually might factor into the interview process differently as individuals. So things like names, things like specific organizations they've worked with, things like that might come into the process, ways that you can be making things. So that's sort of my 3 basic questions around anti-discrimination policies. And remember that you're going to have access to this recording so you can come back and look at these if they're conversations you want to continue as smaller groups. The second is around healthcare benefits. So do you offer equal healthcare coverage for trans individuals without exclusion for medically necessary care? And so this is something that, again, Indeed, I believe does offer. It's always good to be asking the question, do these benefits cover short-term medical leave? So this is something that's very common. If somebody is transitioning on the job, they might take a short leave from work and then come back expressing as the gender identity with which they identify rather than how they identify, or rather than how they express. What are your mental health care benefits like? I don't think it's surprising to many individuals that, mental health or higher, which I think is just a common thing when you face discrimination more generally. So again, what do your benefits look like in this space and how can you be ensuring that these employees feel covered in this space? What is pharmaceutical coverage like? So especially for things like hormones related to transition, that's a super important conversation. And then be thinking about, coverage for reconstructive surgical procedures related to gender affirmation. And I think one of the important things is being able to also respond to individuals who might say, why is this included for trans individuals, but cosmetic surgery for me would not, as a cisgender individual, would not be covered in the same way. So being ready to say, for one individual, this is life affirming. And it's really important to kind of look at the broader context of what that surgery is going to do for that individual. The same way that you might talk about the way, if somebody has a mastectomy and has reparative surgery, that would be covered rather than being seen as just a purely cosmetic thing in a lot of instances and under a lot of policies. So just being able to, respond to those conversations when you're able to. And then do these benefits extend to dependents? And so again, an important conversation to be having. A lot of your employees who might identify as trans might have a family member who's trans, especially, many more parents are learning how to, properly respond to their trans children and how to make sure that they feel taken care of and also they have the medical coverage that they need. So both being aware of having these inclusive policies, but of also communicating these policies effectively to parents and making sure that parents have the resources that they need to also be taking care of their children and making sure that they have the best possible. Cool. The third section I want to focus on quickly, and like I said, we're going quickly through these, but you're going to have all this information afterwards. The third section is data collection. So on this point, do you collect self-identification data on your trans employees? And if so, what language do you use? Obviously, more and more companies are looking to sort of collect this data, really just on their employees more generally. And you are seeing a spike in companies collecting it for their LGBTQ employees. It's often kind of hard to get best practices from other companies because it's something that a lot of people like to keep private. Especially the data is not something that most companies are willing to share. But we do have these conversations a lot at Out&Equal. Obviously, it's a topic that comes up quite a bit for us. And so there are a few best practices. I've pulled these shots, these screenshots directly from our website. So I also encourage you to to reach out to that if you're looking for specific wording for data collection. But the first thing that I want to mention is what to ask. So careful wording is obviously critical because it can really, encourage or discourage people from participating. And the reason you want them to participate is, of course, because once you're able to count them, you're able to better sort of cater your programming, cater your policies to your trans employees. So even though the LGBTQ community might be often grouped together in the way that people think about them and in the way that we discuss it within diversity and inclusion or HR, ask about gender identity and sexual orientation separately because they are two distinct, unique characteristics. The best practice is also to make this question optional and allow employees to bypass them without answering. Even though we encourage people to answer these questions, obviously there are a lot of reasons somebody might not be cool with this, even if it's an anonymous survey. So just always, good to keep that optional. And then if you feel comfortable also asking about the employee's level of openness to discuss this. And so this is, I think, a good thing when trying to really measure the culture at your company, and also maybe, where more education is needed or more work is needed to make people feel included. So, do they feel more included at home versus at work? What's it like on their team? What's it like with their manager relationships? So different sorts of questions you can be asking. We also have sort of best practices around specific wording to use. So this is something that a lot of individuals will ask this question, or a lot of companies will ask the question, how do you identify? And the gender categories will be male, female, transgender man, transgender woman. That's not the language that we're looking to use. So we instead encourage you to use basically questions asking, what is your current gender identity? So the last part of this slide. So male, non-binary, not listed here. So those are gender identities. And then having a separate question that asks, is your gender identity different from the sex you're assigned at birth? As well as, do you identify as transgender? And so sometimes you'll only see one of the first two questions used, and both are best if possible. But I would say, if you had to choose one, just having a question that asks, are you or do you identify as trans, is a good question to include. And then having the question that asks, what is your current gender identity? So they're two separate questions because you're measuring for different things. Cool. And then the last point that I want to make is that for those of you who within your HR function, you have some impact on diversity programming, and I think this is also really true for any employee resource groups that are part of this conversation with us today. When managing and supporting employee resource groups, ensure that your LGBTQ or Pride resource group offers trans inclusive program, and that trans women are welcome in your women's resource group. That's sort of two different conversations. The first one is always, I just think, a good conversation for ERGs to be having, for employee resource groups to be having, around how that programming can really be inclusive of the entire community. And that's an internal conversation to have, within the organization. And there's, again, all sorts of suggestions on our website, but also just always be thinking about ways that you can have specific programming for different segments of the community. And this conversation around trans women welcome in your women's resource group, this is something that at Indeed, trans women, I believe, are welcome in the women's resource group. But again, always be thinking about ways that that programming can potentially be more inclusive in ways that you discuss trans-specific issues. And then the second is that make sure the trans issues always have a place for general diversity education. So considering, the structure of diversity at Indeed, always think of ways that when there are places where you're plugging different, maybe if you have a storytelling campaign at Indeed, or different sorts of diversity education, think of ways that you can plug trans inclusive programming and not just LGBTQ general programming into that framework. I want to give one last reminder before we have a few minutes here at the end for Q&A. And this reminder is that not all trans individuals are looking to transition. When I mentioned this earlier a little bit, and even for those who are, transition looks different from person to person. So especially if you have somebody coming to you, this is probably something as an HR individual you might face on the job, is having somebody come to you to say, I'm looking to transition while at work. What are the different ways you can support me? Like how can I change my name on my email? How can I ensure that my benefits are correct? How can I, what are the policies that cover harassment? Just remember that any transition will look different, so not to make assumptions about that transition. It's always just good to ask the person the specific sort of support that they are looking for, because whether that be, surgical, or whether it be aesthetic, or whether it be specifically around, changing a name, all of those things might look different and they won't all apply to everybody. So just make sure to personalize the conversation around transition to any specific point. Cool. So this time I wanted to make sure we leave a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. So if anybody does have any questions, I welcome you to chat those in now. I have already chatted out my email to everybody, but if anybody does want to send messages later on as they come up, feel welcome to do that. as I mentioned, we also have a lot of best practices on our website. So, if I mention one, like our self-ID best practices or our non-binary best practices, and you want to read more about it, feel welcome to email me or check our website and I can send that to you directly. But if immediately we have any questions about some of the content we covered, feel welcome to ask now. And I know it was quite a bit, but yeah, so if there are any questions, come in. Give it a few minutes. And Allison and Tatiana, I also encourage if you want to step in at any point. From what you've seen of Indeed's practices, are there any glaring areas we need to address? I would say based on our conversations thus far and sort of the policies that have gone through with Allison and Tatiana, I would say no. There are no areas that step out to me as particularly glaring at this point, which thumbs up, awesome. Really, a lot of the questions that we went through at the end of this is more to talk about, ways you can be proactive, because this is something that I expect working in this space, and just from some of the advancements I've seen in the last few years, going to be changing a lot in the next couple of years, especially to be more inclusive of non-binary individuals. So I think that this is maybe one of the places to start the conversation is not only, what benefits and what policies are you offering for sort of the classic narrative of transition that we understand. So somebody who was assigned male at birth but identifies as a woman, or assigned female at birth and identifies as a man. I think a lot of our infrastructure is in place to really pay attention to that narrative of transition. But I think the thing I would encourage you to do is to also think about the ways that your language more generally can be used to non-binary individuals. And to also understand that, many non-binary individuals will also seek to access, benefits related to transition, but they also might have very specific issues, and they might, the language for non-binary individuals needs to be, inclusive of that experience. So to be talking about ways that, your official language on forms, as well as just kind of the ways that you open up conversations around things like benefits, make sure that they're inclusive of experiences outside of the gender binary. So we also have this question from Allison: how can HR business partners specifically practice allyship and spread allyship throughout the business? Yeah, amazing question. So I think, it's a huge question. I think you need to think of this on both like a personal and professional level. So both in the sense of, the example that you set immediately as an individual, as an employee within Indeed, really kind of sets the tone. So be proactively opening up conversations around diversity generally and about trans issues. I never want to kind of downplay the amazing effect and just the way that it signals to individuals that you're an ally, just to be discussing diversity more generally. So, just showing that you open up conversations around pronouns and are thinking about these things proactively, that will signal to all sorts of different people that you're somebody that they can speak to openly and comfortably in a way that is kind of necessary for them to really feel comfortable with an HR individual. So never downplay even the presence of like everybody's welcome here sign on your door kind of thing. Things like that in HR, I have seen have such a positive effect on different HR teams that my organization has worked with, and just really creating like a more inclusive culture where people understand that they can come and feel open with that space. And then of course from there be talking about all the different processes that we were thinking of. So practicing allyship in a job function by making sure that your education programming is inclusive, and understanding really the points where you get to interact with individuals, and making the most of those encounters. I just talked a little bit about signaling when you are an ally and when you are a space where people can come and speak openly. I think that this is a super important thing to do as well with individuals who are starting out. So this is something that, of course, you already discussed, but using that orientation process to show your LGBTQ inclusion and to show trans inclusion, and to really just think through what that process is like for trans individual. I think empathy is really sort of the basis of allyship. So think through what the orientation process might be like for a trans individual, and all the places where they might not feel included, or all the places where they see language that a non-binary individual might not identify with, in ways that you can sort of update that. So I would really just think of all the different processes that your employees go through, which is a practice that I'm sure you're already familiar with, and then think of how that language can be updated and think of how those practices. which is a bit of a simple question or a simple response, but really I think through all those questions that we just went through, thinking about them and having proactive answers to them, that's how you're going to show your allyship through your HR business. And we're coming up on time. So again, I want to thank everybody for joining us here today. And if you do have any questions afterwards, as I mentioned, I shared my email, so feel welcome to reach out to me. And especially if you want sort of more in-depth answers about some of the things that we've discussed. We did sort of more high level, of course, because we really had 90 minutes here today. But if you want more in-depth resources, I always love to continue the conversation if ever possible. And yeah, thank you all for joining us.